As 2022 winds to a close, thought it would be a good idea to give a brief recap about the tumultuous year of 2022 in solar news. I'm Jay Warmke with Blue Rock Station. So let's go ahead and hit for the top 10 stories from the solar industry for the year of 2022. I think historians are going to look back at this year and say it was quite a transitional year for the solar industry. So number 10, any industry is defined nicely by the crooks who are engaged in that industry. Solar, no different. We did see that in 2022, we saw one of the largest installers of solar, which was PowerHome Solar, changed its name to Pink Energy because they were having all sorts of customer service and financial issues. And then ultimately, they went out of business, declaring bankruptcy and claiming that it was all somebody else's fault. So hopefully that's not something we're going to repeat for 2023. In 2022, we saw that Perovskite, which is a technology that really has a lot of promise for the future, sort of coming of age a little bit. Some of the issues around Perovskite that have kept it from becoming a dominant technology have been things like it did leach out some lead, tended to deteriorate in sunlight, problem for solar, and extreme weather. Most of those have been addressed in 2022. Now we're beginning to see Perovskite integrated into silicon-based solar panels, so this is a first step. But I think in the decades to come, we'll probably see the Perovskite as a technology becomes the dominant technology within the solar industry, supplanting silicon. Okay, well, number 8, we're talking about a progression here. Essentially, California did record a day in 2022 where solar produced almost 100% of the energy used on the grid within that state. Now, this is important because those of us in the industry have seen where over the years we've seen predictions that renewables simply cannot handle the needs of the grid, that it is a supplemental technology at best, and we're beginning to see that that simply is not the case. So it's becoming more mature there. Manufacturing returning to the U.S. We did see that, of course, solar evolved from technologies in Germany and the United States. The technology base for manufacturing was exported primarily to China, and then from China to a number of Southeastern Asian nations. Now we're beginning to see, for a lot of reasons, the manufacturing base returning to the United States. And it's not just a return back to the United States. We're seeing this globally, where the supply chain is just too iffy, the industry is too important, so manufacturing is becoming more local in nature. We'll touch on some of the reasons here and some of the other major events of 2022. All right, number 6, we're giving the rebirth of the electric vehicle. Now, again, this is a progressive process, but in 2022, really, EVs sort of entered the mainstream discussion of the folks sitting watching football games saying, hey, that Ford Lightning, that looks pretty cool. So we're beginning to see electric vehicles discussed in the mainstream media as the coming alternative to transportation. And that's a process that's been going on for a while, but we're seeing it now begin to actually play out in our society. And of course, storage, which is part of the whole story of electric vehicles, comes of age. Part of this is certain legislations that allowed for storage to receive tax credits. Again, I'll touch on that here in just a minute. But the cost of lithium-ion batteries continues to fall. We're beginning to see utilities starting to install storage as another mechanism of delivering power in a large scale. And we're beginning to see that now for the first time, most home systems that are installed, most home solar systems, are beginning to incorporate storage, incorporate batteries, or at least incorporate the ability for batteries to be added easily into their systems. The attack on net metering, this is a big story late in the year. We did see California, and California is always the bellwether when it comes to renewable energy, but California instituted what they're referring to as net metering 3.0. And they've gone through, of course, obviously 1.0, 2.0. Every time 5% penetration within that state, they essentially rewrite the rules around net metering. And this became clear that net metering, which is when you're generating more power than you're using, you ship it back to the utility, they pay you. And traditionally, they've been paying retail. You know, it's like I roll my meter backwards when I'm sending power to the utility. I pay for the power when I get it, and hopefully at the end of the month we zero out. Well, that's a bygone notion. Essentially, the utilities are saying, listen, buddy, we are not going to be paying you retail for power that you're generating and selling to us in the future. Yeah, you can understand their perspective. They're in the business of selling power, not letting you have free access to the grid. So we're seeing net metering under attack. That is going to have a dramatic impact on the industry as we move forward. Number three, well, basically in a week, in early 2022, 75% of all of the materials for installation of solar just disappeared. And this came about because the Biden administration announced they would allow for an investigation by the Commerce Department to proceed. The whole backstory here is that the Trump administration imposed tariffs on solar from China. China moved some of their operations to a number of Southeast Asian nations, and somebody had the gall to say, hey, I think they moved them to these nations to avoid the tariffs. So once the investigation began, if it was found against them, which everyone in the industry assumed would happen, then the people buying these products might have been liable for as much as 200% penalties. So if you're saying I'm going to order $1 million worth of solar panels, but when I get them, I might actually have to pay $2 or $3 million for them, you're not going to do it. So in that 1 week, about 80%, 75% of the product for the solar industry just simply disappeared. Well, that led to some concerns about supply chain, which led to concerns saying, listen, we cannot be that dependent in such a critical industry for foreign sources of our materials. We need to start bringing this home. So that's the number three. The number two, well, in a lot of ways, this is perhaps the biggest story of the year, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this, again, exacerbated the whole supply chain issue, but it did lead, maybe not for the first time, but in a very dramatic way, the weaponization of energy. And so Western Europe, much of Europe, certainly the Ukraine, they begin to see, okay, we cannot be dependent on our energy needs from Russia in this instance. So it kickstarted a lot of investment into renewable energy within the European Union, which of course then added further pressure to the supply chain. So we're beginning to see once again that if energy is going to be weaponized, we can't be dependent upon Russia, the Middle East, whatever other foreign sources of energy. So renewable energy, being local in nature, definitely gets a kickstart because of this. It's one of the fallouts from that invasion. And of course, the big story in 2022 is the Inflation Reduction Act, the big story from a solar perspective. Many of those people in this industry say that years to come, we're going to say that there was an industry before the Inflation Reduction Act and an industry after. For the first time now, we're seeing long-term incentives in place. We're seeing incentivization of domestic production. We're seeing the incentivization for putting these systems in places that have been polluted, that are traditionally fossil fuel, that are low income. So we're really seeing a dynamic shift in how renewable energy will be installed and sourced in the future. And that's the news from the solar industry for this past year. We'll see you next week.